guys, we're back. What I'll do is throw up on screen real quickly what we're going to be working on today, but essentially from the last video, we got up to the point where we could start to work on the physics of our motocross game. But the thing is, before we kind of continue on that journey and start building out the physics and refining them, we're going to need a place to test them, right? Make sure that they're actually good. And just have an area where we can hit some jumps, some whoops, go across some berms, and just make sure that everything is actually, as we want it to be. Now, Unreal does come with a little bit of a car test environment, but it's pretty basic, and we want something a little bit cooler, to be honest, right? So that's what we're going to do today, work on a little moto compound to test our physics out as we build them. So how did we go about this? Well, the first thing is that if you just go on YouTube, and that's pretty much my source of truth for the whole project, YouTube. So if you go on YouTube and you just type in like level design, right? What you pretty much end up with is tutorials for first person or third person shooters, which are all about blocking out maps and using like modular components like walls to build houses and essentially first person shooter maps. But this isn't going to be something that works for our game. We're not just making a static mesh that is a jump, plopping it down and being good to go. We're really using the landscape, right? When you actually look at like a motocross track, a jump is a pretty handcrafted piece of landscape. So the next step was to look at some landscape videos on Unreal Engine 5 and building those out. But once again, super lackluster in terms of what we get, right? It's pretty much a couple tutorials of people showing you how to make like a pretty basic mountain that doesn't look super realistic, carve some chunks out of it, and add some pretty boring textures to that landscape. So I felt a little bit stuck, right? How do we actually get, handcrafted, detailed dirt jumps? Well, what I did here is I just turned to the MX Bikes and MX Sim and MX Verse ATV communities to understand how are the modders for these games making these fucking beautiful tracks and importing them in, right? So the way that it kind of works is essentially two options. The first option is that these guys would model the tracks in a 3D software like Blender or L3DT, and then convert that model to a height map and import the height map as a landscape. Otherwise, they would just create the like height map directly in Photoshop and then import the height map into the game. The key piece here being the tracks are crafted as a height map and imported as that. So what is a height map, you might be asking? Well, essentially, this is just a top-down or bird's eye view image of a landscape where black represents the lowest point and white represents the highest point. And that gradient in between black and white is essentially the change in, I suppose, level, right? So if we have a smooth gradient, that's just going to be a ramp. And if we have a gradient that is a little bit more of a curve, that's going to look like a jump. So hopefully you're following along with what I'm kind of showing on screen here, but it's actually fairly simple in concept. But as you can see, you do need to be a little bit meticulous with how you're actually, I suppose, crafting these gradients, right? And there's a lot of testing back and forth just to make sure that that gradient looks and also feels like the jump you want it to end up being. Now, as I mentioned, there's essentially two options. You can build the height map directly in Photoshop, or you can build the actual track in a 3D software and convert that to a height map. Now, that sounded way too hard, so I kind of lent on the easier side here of building it out in Photoshop directly. And so what I did is just built out a couple gradients. I also borrowed some example jump height maps from some templates that are uploaded online and eventually put them together to start crafting out the ideal compound that I wanted. So I wanted a little bit of a small motocross track for testing and then also some jumps off to the side. So, just a couple doubles, maybe a triple, and then some different size whoops as well, right? Because initially I was also a little bit worried I might not even be able to do a full lap around the moto track. So maybe just having a couple straight line jumps off to the side is going to be the best place to start. Once we had this basic layout and our track, I also just ended up adding a little bit of a blob, as you can see, and that simply represents a hill, right? So it's pretty simple and pretty cool how we can start to build out this track. we could also preview it inside of this tool called Resolute Track Builder, which was super helpful to be able to just, place the pieces in Photoshop, preview what it looked like in the Resolute Builder. And eventually we got to the end where we got this result over here. Now, before I was going to import this directly into Unreal, I wanted to test it and make sure that, the track flowed, it was fun, and just compare it to my baseline, which is MX Bikes, right? So MX Bikes is really the goal that I'm trying to achieve with my game as well. So imported that into MX Bikes, and hopefully in the background right now, what you're seeing is me spinning a quick lap of it. And I'm gonna be honest, this was not the best track I've played in MX Bikes. I've played way more fun, way more flowy tracks, but you know what? It did exactly what we needed. It was fun. It had a couple different jump types, and it was easy, right? That's what I wanted, like a simple, basic track where I can just hit a couple jumps and flow around. I will say this process was actually also super fun. I think I spent so much time just sitting here kind of refining and playing around with different track layouts until I landed on this one. Anyways though, so now that we had our track, we needed to get it into Unreal Engine. So in the landscape section, you can jump in and import height maps into Unreal. And something that sounds a bit silly here, but that tripped me up a bit, is that when I would click to import my height map, you'd get a little bit of a preview on the right. And I was kind of struggling, like, why does this preview look like a big lump of garbage, right? It didn't look anything like what my track was. So I don't know, I was like playing around with the settings, second guessing myself, researching stuff, and I thought I had an issue with an 8-bit versus 16-bit height map. And then eventually I just fucking hit import and realized that the preview is just a preview and everything was actually good to go to import my map. What you'll notice though is that you do need to play around with the scaling a bit to figure out, hey, how high is that highest point or how wide is the widest point, just to make sure that the scaling and the feeling is mapping back to what you intended, right? Okay, awesome. So, huge progress. We now actually have a test compound in Unreal Engine 5. However, it is looking a little bit boring. So this is where we need to take a little bit of a step to also, once again, steer away from the tutorials and figure out how do we make it just a little bit prettier, add some dirt tracks, maybe a little bit of roughness here and there, some tire marks. That was going to be our next challenge. Okay guys, so we are live in Unreal Engine now, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we can take it from, a pretty boring, ugly environment to something that looks a little bit nicer, right? Firstly, I also hope you can't hear my keyboard clacking away in the background, but you see, this is also it's a pretty simple process, but at the same time, it's also a little bit confusing, which you'll see in a minute. All we're doing is really painting to make it pretty. So on the left, we've got a couple layers over here. We have our ground, which is this little grid pattern, I suppose. And what we have is, normally we'll start out with our base layer. So this is going to be our dirt. As you can see, we're just kind of painting it in over here. Let's get it all around our little dirt jump. And of course, you can kind of smooth the edges. You can also use a different paintbrush for like a little bit of a more erosion or blending effect. And now that we have our base layer, something I noticed people doing is at the very top of their jumps, they would sort of lighten it. And this looked a little bit more realistic, but it also just made the tops of the jumps like kind of easier to identify, if that makes sense. And it was also kind of like on the sides and the back when I looked in like MX Sim and that. So we can, kind of paint that in, blend it a little bit there. Once again, a little bit nice and wide at the top. And then we'd also have our compact dirt, which is kind of like, our tire marks, if you will. So maybe make the brush a bit smaller, do like a long one, like a nice little long one there. Maybe we'll go back and, turn the brush down, line it up a little bit in the middle, a bit on top. I reckon we could go a bit darker on, wrong side, a bit darker on the tire marks here. And then we can kind of tie it all together with our decal. And if we go back to selection, Wrong keys. There. We do something like this. It starts to look, a little bit more realistic now. I will admit this one looks pretty terrible. Let's maybe pivot down over here where we have a little bit of a better visual representation. So, we've been a bit more thoughtful with the painting process. The actual tire marks are blended in quite nicely, and it's not, it's not amazing, but it looks pretty convincing. It looks good enough. Now, when I say this is a little bit harder than I anticipated, I'll show you what you mean in a sec. So if we go into the actual landscape, right, we have our base layer, we have our ground, we have our compact dirt. Let's take a look at what it looks like to actually get all of that into Unreal. So what the fuck is this shit over here? Like, what the fuck is this? I did this and I don't even understand what any of this does. Like, it is just a absolute shocking spaghetti of shit to get what you want, right? All this is really doing as well is it's just kind of making it so the texture isn't tiling and it doesn't look repetitive. It's adding in like some variation, and it's just doing a little bit of different stuff here and there. At the top as well, I kind of added in this like custom grid pattern because I really thought this like floor that you see over here, I just thought it looked kind of cool, very game dev like, because in Unreal, as soon as you start to build out these landscapes, you kind of have to pick a default terrain and you can't just select the grid. So made my own. And then beyond that, if we look at something like this decal, this gave me a huge amount of issues early on, right? If we go back to this little example here, this looks absolutely terrible, like this instance over here. Now, conceptually, this isn't anything crazy. What we have is our sample. All it is it's really like a normal map. And then what I figured out really helps is I made this custom little texture sample in Photoshop, like this gradient, and we're using this to blend the edges so it's not so harsh. And we're also turning down the opacity. And so it's not on this instance over here, but it is applied to these instances. And as you can see, blending out the edges, lowering the opacity, it actually starts to look pretty good. But I'll also show up on screen what it originally looked like, which was even worse. But yeah, I think what we'll do is let's jump into a quick little fly over of the map and kind of show you the finished product of what we've built so far in today's video. You probably are pretty annoyed hoping to see some gameplay at this point. I promise you, next video very soon, we're going to be doing a hot lap with the current physics we've built out of the entire track.